Hi, everyone. I'm talking to you about Chapter 16 today from our book, in which we will be looking at legal controls and freedom of expression as these issues relate to mass media. So, to start, when we talk about freedom of expression in the United States, this is rooted in the 5 rights outlined in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which states Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. So, as outlined in this amendment, we are guaranteed the rights of freedom of speech, free exercise of religion, freedom of press, freedom of petition of the government, and freedom of assembly. All of these freedoms are relevant for thinking about mass media, as they outline our rights in relation to how speech acts work in and through media. Freedom of speech doesn't mean that you can actually say anything, though, and there are some types of speech that are generally not protected by the First Amendment. This includes things like obscenity, fighting words or hate speech, defamation, which includes libel and slander, child pornography, perjury, blackmail, incitement to imminent lawless action, truth threats, solicitations to commit crimes, plagiarism, and treason, all of which are more clearly outlined in your book. So, then who does this apply to? Where do these freedoms apply? Do they apply to all of us as individuals? Do they apply to companies or institutions? Do they apply online the same way that they do in person? So these are some of the questions that we're going to be thinking about. In relation to freedom of the press, for example, the courts have historically ruled that newspaper publishers have the right of press and paper purchasers pay for the right to read their material. Over the air, terrestrial broadcasters use the broadcasting spectrum, which, as we've discussed in the past, is owned by the public. And so there's regulation there, but there's far less regulation on, say, social media platforms. And this is largely because companies have resisted being classified as media companies, and so currently do not fall under current regulations of media companies, which we've also talked about in the past. So that means that something like a social media platform is not actually listed as a media company. What this means is that newspaper publishers, for example, have responsibility for what is published in their paper since they own the press and the paper. Terrestrial broadcasters are similar, but because the broadcasting spectrum is owned by the public, there are more regulations that can be applied to broadcasting than to newspapers, which are often not publicly owned. Social media companies are more similar to newspapers, really, but have even less regulation than them. And there are so few regulations, as we've discussed in previous weeks, in part because legal regulations haven't been updated as the internet has expanded, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. An important case related to the freedom of the press was called the FCC versus Pacifica Foundation from 1978. This case provides the basis for the FCC's legal jurisdiction to censor and control what can and can't be said on broadcast media. But some people argue that because freedom of the press is guaranteed in the Constitution, this kind of regulation shouldn't happen at all, even though there is already legal precedent, which raises a question. Does the First Amendment deny government any power to restrict public broadcast and indecent language under any circumstance? Or are there cases where these restrictions are good, where we might actually want the government to regulate broadcasting? To answer this question, we can also look at many other court cases that have tried to weigh in on the right of free press or the right of the people to know versus protections for personal privacy, which come up also in your book. For the most part, these court cases have protected strong freedom of press with some minor regulations for severe cases. The New York Times versus Sullivan in 1964 established that the media could publish anything except that which had deliberate malicious intent. Later, Redline Broadcasting Company versus the FCC in 1969 stated that broadcasters were required to give those attacked response time to accusations on air. So if you were to give someone time to publicly speak out against someone, technically broadcasters are required to give the people who have been spoken out against or have been attacked time to respond. So equal time, equal space. And in the Miami Herald publishing versus Torneo in 1974, it was stated that print publishers, unlike broadcasters, were not required to respond to accusations. So you see some of these differences that are highlighted in a couple of slides ago coming up here, right? Because print is not publicly owned, they're not required to give the same kind of space, the same kind of equal space and time, where broadcasters, because they are using public airways, are required to match time for people to respond. And then finally, in 1988, there's the case of Falwell versus Hustler magazine. This case outlines emotional distress, even with bad motive, is not a good enough reason to censor a story, even if the claims about the person are outrageous. So in this case, in 1988, the case centered on this famous televangelist who tried to sue Hustler magazine for an exaggerated joke ad printed here, where the running joke is about Falwell's first time. It was a series. There were a number of other celebrities that were included in it. And the first time is really about the first time drinking Campari. But in the story that's printed, the first time Falwell's experience with drinking Campari is with his mother. The running joke is that he's talking about sexual relations. And so it's fairly insulting. It's a fictitious story. But he claimed that it caused him a significant amount of emotional and reputational distress because of his status as a public conservative and Christian figure. But the court in this case ruled that as a satirical ad, and it did say very clearly on the bottom that it was satire, if in very tiny print that you can see there. The court still ruled that as a satire, this didn't count as definite defamation. So although Falwell was embarrassed, it wasn't really slander because it was trying to be a joke and it couldn't be taken as serious. And so therefore it couldn't be regulated and didn't need to be censored in any way. So more recently, though, this prior tradition of strong press protections have come into question, especially around issues of defamation in different ways. An example is from 2016, when the professional wrestler Terry Hulk Hogan sued Gawker Media for publishing a tape of him sleeping with the wife of his best friend without his knowledge. Hogan's lawyer argued that the publication of the video amounts to an invasion of privacy and that it had no news value and that it only served as fodder for the reader and clicks for a source of advertising revenue. Essentially, the story wasn't really anything. It only served to hurt Hulk Hogan, this was their argument, and his reputation, and didn't really have any actual newsworthy content or material. And so there was nothing about it that suggested that it was important for the public to know this information. So the court sided with Hulk Hogan and awarded him $115 million and another $25 million in punitive damages to be paid by Gawker Media. And this actually bankrupted Gawker Media, and they were forced to close operations as a result of this court case. This lawsuit raises what legal scholars say are important and largely unresolved issues about the line between privacy and free expression in the internet era in particular. You can actually see a documentary on this on Netflix called Nobody Speak. So net neutrality is another important issue that relates to freedom of speech rights. There's a full video, but if I play it, you're going to really just have to listen to 5 minutes of uncomfortable audio coming through like multiple recordings, which is unpleasant. So I'm just going to link it in the same area of the module as this lecture. I recommend that you pause this and go watch that and then come back. So as discussed in the video, the issue here that's relevant for freedom of expression and free speech is of having equal access or equal lanes in this visual is like a good representation of what we're talking about, where the fast lane would give you quicker access to certain sites if you were willing to pay more, but you might also be stuck in a slow lane that wouldn't give you the same equal access. And we've talked about this in the past of who is it that would end up having more rights, right? That video has some really great conversations in it too about who's interested in this and why. So another really big issue now is regulation of online speech. As mentioned earlier, internet service providers and online speech in general is not really regulated currently at all. This is an intense debate because of the ramping up of the problems related to the spread of misleading information online, both politically and medically. So, issues of misinformation, disinformation, fake or false news. We see this discussed a lot around the spread of conspiracy theories like Pizzagate and QAnon and anti vax communities. There have been strong concerns about incorrect health information being spread online in particular. And so, as a result, people have suggested that there should be more regulation of speech online with more materials flagged or removed from sites. We've seen some examples of this too with companies like Twitter and Facebook flagging or removing content related to stories that are seen to be perpetuating conspiracies, hate speech, or incorrect information. And this is what's known as content moderation, an internal form of regulation companies use to regulate content on their platform. And I've given you guys an article to read this week about this and why it's happening by private companies. However, there are some people who argue that this kind of content moderation violates free speech and First Amendment protections. They also argue that it's biased because many times what is censored appear to be conservative viewpoints, although there's much debate about this, and there are some good documentaries covering this that I can also link. It's important to note, though, that these platforms are private companies, so technically they have no obligation to uphold free speech under current regulations. There's some other problems that have come up related to content moderation and arguments about censorship, though. Although I mentioned that these companies technically don't have to uphold First Amendment rights as private companies, many people view these spaces as important to the public sphere for expressing ourselves. So, especially as you can imagine, during lockdown, right, when it became one of the few places we had for public forums. So many YouTube content creators, in particular, have spoken out about these forms of censorship. They feel like the platforms have imposed upon them through strategies of demonetization or by stopping paying content creators when they have materials in their videos that are deemed not advertiser friendly. And sometimes this is because it might be that they're using hate speech. It might also be that they could be mentioning something like a violent event that happened in the world or talking about issues that are seen as controversial. So, as much as people claim that this is primarily a problem for conservative viewpoints, people who speak on LGBTQ plus rights issues, Black Lives Matter movement have also similarly faced issues of being demonetized, if not fully deplatformed. Many of these creators argue that demonetizing videos on these topics effectively works to censor them because it will discourage creators from talking about these things, which makes these ideas less visible and accessible to people. And some argue ultimately then that this is infringing on people's freedom of speech. So finally, I want to run through some issues that we've seen come up today and discuss whether or not they are actually protected by the First Amendment. And this actually relates to the writing exercise this week, because I think you'll find it interesting to see what people think is and is not covered by the First Amendment. And you'll find it interesting in yourself, I'm sure. But seeing the differences in generational perceptions on this might also be interesting to you. So first, case number one. You're banned from a social media platform. This happened a couple of times, kind of on a large scale around people like Alex Jones, but also in much more kind of small, mundane ways. People get banned from platforms somewhat frequently, or temporarily banned, shadow banned, etc. While you might think this is a First Amendment issue, it actually isn't. This scenario illustrates one of the biggest misconceptions people have about the First Amendment. The bottom line is that it protects you from the government punishing or censoring or oppressing your speech. This does not apply to private organizations. So again, if Twitter, as a private organization, decides to ban you, you're kind of out of luck. You can't make a First Amendment claim in court. However, while it's not unconstitutional officially, if private platforms outright ban certain types of protected speech, it's an uncomfortable precedent for the values of free speech, and one that's still very important for us to think about. Case number two. You're fired from your job for something you say in public or online. If you work for a private company, it's probably not a First Amendment issue. Ultimately, it's often the company's right to discipline their employees' speech, and they do this through the language of keeping in kind with the brand image, etc., right? So often they do this just because the private employer has the right to fire someone. This doesn't give them legal carte blanche. So depending on what the fired employee said, the employer could be in violation of a Civil Rights Act or possibly in violation of contract law. If you're a government employee, though, this is a complicated issue. Institutions like police departments, public schools, and branches can't restrict employees' free speech rights, but they do need to assure that it doesn't keep the employee from properly doing their job. It's definitely a kind of fuzzy balancing act, and the rise of social media has made it much harder for institutions to regulate this. Case number 3. A university or public group cancels a speech or presentation by a controversial figure. If it's a private institution, again, it's probably not a First Amendment issue. If it's a public institution, the lines can get pretty blurry. So in the case of Rutgers, which is technically a public university, you invite someone to speak on your campus, and if you're at a public university, you have to respect their First Amendment rights. But that doesn't mean that you can't put regulations on speech, like dictating the time, place, venue, and suggestions for subject matter. It just means that you can't do it in a way that discriminates against a certain point of view officially. If students protesting play a hand in moving or canceling the speaker, that presents a different free speech challenge. If the speaker were to take legal action for being blocked from speaking, which has happened, they can't take a constitutional action against a group of private citizens. So, in other words, they can't attack the students. Such a complaint would have to go against the school for allowing the constitutional breach to happen. Case number 4. You're arrested while recording police activities in public. This is definitely a First Amendment issue. While there are exceptions and nuances, this is definitely unconstitutional. If you are trying to incite people, even then it needs to be a true threat in order to actually justify the arrest. It needs to be a true threat, one that has some sort of immediacy, an actual intent for it to not be protected by the Constitution and the First Amendment. Case number 5, you're arrested for saying something critical of the government. So this is also definitely a First Amendment issue with the same considerations as our last example. It is unconstitutional for you to be arrested for saying something critical of the government, unless you're trying to incite people to violence with your speech in a way that makes it a true threat legally. Case number 6, your comment or post is deleted from an online forum. As we've discussed some already, this is a private company, so it is not a First Amendment issue. Private companies like social media sites can basically do whatever they want, but regulating conversations and posts online is the balance for social media giants, because if they remove too much, people will stop using the platform. Finally, case number 7. You were fined by your employer or institution for not standing for the national anthem, and this also happens for expulsions for students. So this absolutely 100% is a First Amendment issue, at the very least in spirit. So symbolic speech is protected by the Constitution. So in essence, you have the right to not speak. You have the right to silence. In theory, a private employer could require you to stand for the anthem or say the Pledge of Allegiance, but such requirements may open them up to lawsuits. So even in schools where there have been some cases of students being singled out for sitting or for kneeling for the anthem, it would be hard to provide justification for punishment from the school. The school is the one who is actually in violation. This is an act of political speech, which is traditionally the most protected type of free speech. And it is completely not disruptive, of course, because it's also silent. So there's really no argument against why this wouldn't be protected. Okay, so that is all. If you haven't already, please make sure to read Chapter 16 in your textbook for more information on today's topic and for information on the ways that free speech and legal protections intersect with the media. Watch the lectures and linked videos. Be sure to check out your classmates' mass media mini lectures and comment on them. You guys have been doing awesome jobs with those. I've been really excited to see them every week, so good luck. The writing analysis option for this week is based on the First Amendment quiz we just did, so I'm curious to hear how people in your life respond to similar questions. Come up with cases that you find interesting. Have a great week, everybody. Bye.